So prevention programs and prevention policies in addiction science. What's left? We talked about school-based programs. We talked about community-based programs. We talked about mass media campaigns. So what are the next steps? What are the questions remaining that we really should answer? And there's some very important ones. So the first is, if we poured all of these resources into school-based campaigns, if we poured all of these resources into community programs, why don't they work? They seem, even the ones that are on solid theoretical foundation, have a solid theoretical foundation, even the ones that have good empirical evidence on small pilot scales, why don't they work when applied at a larger scale? Well, one of the reasons is poor intervention fidelity. Now, fidelity is the idea of how close the implementation of a program is to the developed part in the research world. So it's like saying, in a randomized clinical trial, you need to take 4 pills of this one product a day to see an effect. But when put into the real world, maybe people only take 1 or 2. And if they only take 1 or 2, there's really poor intervention fidelity. So essentially, the intervention is not implemented as initially described. So in the example here on the screen, a low fidelity replication study may only implement parts 1 and 4 of a 4-part program. And they might do that for resource purposes. They don't have the information, they don't have enough resources, they don't have enough capability to implement the whole thing. So poor intervention fidelity might be one reason why these prevention programs don't work when applied on a large scale. They might not work because of lack of generalizability. So most of these evaluations have been done in the United States. And while the United States is a large country, we're certainly not the largest. And they were certainly not the only culture in the world. Even other developed countries, the culture is just can be dramatically different from the United States. So even if they've been designed in the United States, when they're applied to other countries, whether that's developed countries, whether that's developing countries, the interventions may no longer be culturally appropriate for those environments. And then even if they are, the findings may not be transferable to other countries, even if it's a high fidelity study, even if you take the intervention exactly as intended, even if you use culturally appropriate material, the intervention may simply not be transferable. It may not be appropriate to different types of environments. You may have a prevention program that works, whether it's a school-based program, whether it's a family-based program, whether it's a mass media campaign, but the population that you're targeting may simply be wrong. Maybe the intervention was developed in adults and you're applying it to adolescents, or maybe the reverse is true. Maybe the intervention was developed using current users, but you're really focusing to prevent initiation of use, those first-time users, so it's not really all that effective. Or maybe the intervention only works among heavy users, or maybe it only works among light users and you're applying it to the opposite population. So the program might work in a very controlled environment, in a very specific population, but you've simply chosen the wrong population to begin with. And finally, maybe you just don't have the resources. You don't have the resources to implement a full high fidelity campaign. You don't have the resources in a mass media campaign to have enough ads out there to overcome what common knowledge is. This is particularly true for legal drugs like alcohol. We are in a concentrated, a saturated alcohol advertising environment. The graph here looks at the advertising spending of beer manufacturers in the U.S. So this is just U.S. beer advertising. Only the top two, so AB InBev and Molson Coors, they're spending $1.1 billion in advertising revenue, and that's not talking about all of the other beer manufacturers out there. That's not including distilled spirits. That's not including wine or hard ciders. This is just the beer manufacturers. And this isn't just a US phenomenon. This is advertising expenditure for alcoholic beverages in Germany. So on average, the alcohol industry in Germany has spent about 500 million euros. And Germany is a much smaller country than the United States, and this is an enormous sum. So if you're producing a campaign or a program to reduce alcohol use, your campaign needs to compete with this. Your program needs to compete with this. It needs to compete with all of these pro-alcohol messages in a much shorter amount of time. But is it worth it to try? Is it worth it to try to implement one of these prevention campaigns or programs? Is it worth it to try a mass media campaign? And my answer is yes. Yes, it is worth it if you can afford it. So if you have the resources available and you are very patient to see the results. So the good behavior game, which I mentioned in another video, it does work, but it costs a lot of money. To really implement it as it's intended costs about $160 per child. But it's really cost effective. After 13 years, you save about $59 in healthcare costs and lost wages and things like that for every dollar you invest. So that $160 at the beginning will save a lot of money on the back end, but you have to wait for it. It takes 13 years to realize this investment. Now, 13 years with a typical NIH research cycle is 3 research cycles away. So it's maybe hard to justify having a long-term cohort study to actually see the effect. So that could be another reason why we don't actually see these programs working, is that it may take 10, 15 years before the outcomes can actually be seen. Life skills training programs, another program that does actually work. It costs about $100 per child. You see $13 in savings for every one of those 100. So you see $1,300 in savings for every child that is part of this program. But you have to wait 11 years for the program to work. And the Strengthening Families program, which I mentioned in a previous video, as an example of a family program that works but is highly intensive. So for 10 to 14-year-olds, it costs $1,100 per child, so a lot of upfront investment, but you see about $3.59 saved on the back end for every dollar you invest. So if you invest $1,100, you're saving about $3,600 20 years later. So if you're in an environment where you can wait 20 years to see an outcome, it's worth it to do it. But looking for immediate results, these programs may not be effective.